Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Startup Central, and today on the show, we're bringing you a special on International Women's Day. Women are stepping up, innovating, and shaping up industries of the future. And honestly, it's amazing to be witnessing that change. And on segment 2 of the show, we're putting the spotlight on Naya Sagi, the founder and CEO of EDT Life. Let's welcome her on the show. Thank you very much, Naya, for joining us here on 80 Now. Since we're talking about female founders and entrepreneurs, I was just talking about some data that we've sourced from Traction in the first segment of the show. So let me take you through that data. Now, female founders in the country are accounting for 7.5% of all active startups. Over 2.9K startups are in the space that have received funding till date, and all of these are by women-led founders. And of the overall $11.8 billion of funding of tech startups that happened in 2024, women-driven startups got $1 billion. Now, as somebody who's from the Mumbai tech ecosystem and who's been an entrepreneur for a very long while, how does this data really look to you? Is it concerning?
Samita, it doesn't obviously look great. However, here's where I kind of line on this from a very different perspective on, right? I think the reality is that there are more and more women now founding tech startups, right? So if you look at what we see play out in the Mumbai tech ecosystem as well, it's the emerging ventures such as what Preeti is building with Lakshmi, or what Rolly is building with Babblebots, or what Manisha Raisingani is building with SIF Labs. So there are more and more tech ventures being built by incredible women in tech. And I think these are going to be the ones that get a lot more funding in the future. So far, investors were looking at scale ventures, or, they were looking at a certain paradigm. I think the paradigm is changing. So what we see today as data is certainly not going to be representative of the data I hope to see in the next 5 years from now.
Right, Naya, and that's essentially what I was coming to next. What's been your journey? You've worked at McKinsey, and then you started building your startups, building Baby Chakra, and now you're also building a consumer electronics brand. You form part of the top 1% of women and are privileged in that sense, because we have very many women who do not even have the basic necessities. Now, talking about your journey, were you looked at differently were you ever told to bring a man along when you were presenting or whenever you went for a fundraise, for instance, and presented to investors?
I've been told that all the time, Samita. In my first company, Baby Chakra, I was a sole founder. And every time I'd go, not every time, but I think in the early days when I'd go for a fundraise, I was told, why don't you have a co-founder and preferably a male? That conversation did come up even in a later stage. But I think what ended up happening was that they kept on seeing the company deliver on certain milestones and metrics. And I was able to shut it down. And by the way, Samita, I have no problem with having a male co-founder or having a co-founder. I do think building a company is essentially a lonely journey, and it's always fun to build with a co-founder. But you also have to find somebody who is as passionate and mission aligned as you for the company you're building, right? And we never ended up finding that person. In my new company edition, which we are building in stealth, I do have a co-founder, which is in stealth. So, we will share more on that later. But I highly recommend that, we do find co-founders to build with. And I also highly recommend that investors don't force co-founders down sole women founder-led companies, because it's just counterproductive.
Right, and Naya, it goes without saying that delivering is a non-negotiable. But what's the mindset now that persists when it comes to women-led founders? And most importantly, how are investors looking at these companies that have been formed by women, that have been started by women?
I think there are three mindsets which are changing. So I want to continuously clarify it as changing. The first mindset is around women-led founders, women-led companies are, probably going to be very touchy-feely companies. They can't be hard tech companies. And part of that comes from the second sort of bias that women founders are not technically oriented or can't be technical founders. I think these two biases, they kind of go hand in hand, right? And which is why when you look at the funding patterns, a lot of the funding that's probably gone to companies are largely consumer companies, because investors have this bias that, well, women understand consumer sentiment, so they can build for that cohort. Less of that goes to technical companies, to deep tech companies run by women. I think these are the first two biases. I think the third bias is around a certain set of self-selection that teams end up doing, because Unfortunately, I think an older generation was pretty much trained on, reporting to men as leaders. They haven't really learned to see women in leadership roles. So in many cases, I've seen younger women, especially first-time entrepreneurs who happen to be women, struggle to get really good quality talent to join them and have an understanding that I'm the CEO here. I think that's changing, though, Sumita. I do want to clarify that is changing because more and more we talk about the women who are successful. They become role models for the rest of India. And I also see the new generation thinking very differently about leadership and leadership styles.
Right, Naya, and I'm glad that that is fast changing because these are some of the stories that we keep hearing every now and then from women-led founders. But coming back to the point about data and representation of women, if you heard me, it still remains low. But why is that? Is it because of largely the support infrastructure or the lack of support infrastructure? Is it because women are not pushing their stories enough? Now, from a society's point of view, does it eventually just come down to tokenism rather than actual work and actual deliverables?
So, the reality, Samita, is that a lot of women actually look at life in a way where they're constantly having to fight a whole set of battles, both at home as well as in the workplace, right? For entrepreneurship, what one needs to do is kind of get out of that fighting the small battles and really kind of optimizing for the big battles mindset. The women who are able to do that are disproportionately successful. The 7% you mentioned of women starting up, I mean, they're the ones who are getting the 1 to 2% of funding, right? So it's a very small cohort, but they're getting a larger sort of chunk of the pie, if you really think about it from that angle as well. Um, Here's where I come out on this, and I don't want to generalize, but there are three pieces to building a company out. One is capital, the other one is talent, and the third is a supportive community. Now, capital, we know, has been always a challenge when it comes to women-led ventures. But again, with the narrative shift that we see with companies like, Atlin, for instance, doing so well, with exits happening in the ecosystem with women-founded companies, I think that narrative is also shifting. It's shifting slowly, but it's shifting. What, however, needs to shift is the investor demographic. I'm seeing more and more women investors from the investor side, but that has not completely shifted as quickly. So I think once the representation of the investor cohort shifts, we'll see deployment of capital shift quite quickly as well. I think the second and the third, the community as well as the talent. Talent is moving as well, like I mentioned, because the Gen Zs now care more about the leadership style versus caring about the gender of the person. So I think that is moving in a good way. And community. So, organizations such as ours, the Tech Entrepreneurs Association of Mumbai, or I'm part of this WhatsApp community called the Female Founders Group, which has more than 250 odd female founders from across the country. I think these communities help women founders come together and some very basic questions on how to deal with sexism, how to deal with, investors, questions which are not warranted in certain situations, how to negotiate hard on capital terms. I think these get addressed by the community angle as well.
Right now, in fact, I was just speaking with Ms. Kiran Majumdar show, and she also spoke about how capital deployment and getting capital still remains a challenge. But one final question before we let you go: all the development, all the progress that we've made, do you see that getting off the track because Donald Trump in the United States, being the US president, has decided to scrap off DEI initiatives, and that's essentially also leading companies, for instance, some companies like Salesforce, Meta, and Disney reportedly scaling back on these initiatives. Doesn't that bring in fresh challenges when it comes to inclusion of women in the workforce?
I won't specifically comment on what's happening in the US because I think the US is going through a reckoning of its own, Samita. I think it goes back to all of us saying fundamentally what is right for all of us to do as companies, as individuals, and as humanity. There are certain decisions that you make which need to be done because it is the right thing to do. But more importantly, certain decisions need to be made which need to be backed by fact and logic and data. The data actually clearly tells you that women run businesses give you more than 1.5x to about 2x in the dollar as returns than men led businesses, right? Data tells you, there's BCG, McKinsey reports to that, and longitudinal studies to that effect that say that women actually return capital more than 3x on exits than men do on an average. So if this data exists, the question that we have to ask ourselves is that when we look at inclusion, are we looking at it from just like a good to have, or is it a must have for us, not just to move forward as society, but also to move forward as an economy? And that is the question we need to think for ourselves as a country and as India, in isolation of whatever else is happening in the world. Because I believe in India, we do things differently. We do things with India and the Indian context in mind.
Absolutely, Naya, the fight is not done yet. And as we move forward, the question we need to now ponder upon is how fast this ecosystem of women-led founders we built that fully unleashes their potential. Thank you very much, Naya, for joining us once again right here on Startup Central. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's a wrap on this edition of Startup Central. It's our International Women's Day special programming. Hope you liked the show as much as we did putting it together for you. From me and the entire team, goodbye and thank you very much for staying with us.